Hey, what's going on? Welcome to the Podcast Accelerator, the thrice-weekly show that brings you podcast education, industry insights, and straight-talking reactions to podcasting news. I am your host, Mark Asquith, that British podcast guy and CEO and co-founder of Rebel-Based Media, the podcast tech company that creates the Podcast Success Academy, podcast websites, Productivity, Rebel-Based Studios, and Captivate.fm, the world's only growth-oriented podcast host, where you can get your first month of podcast hosting for just $1, and you can transfer an existing podcast into Captivate completely for free. Now, today on the show, we are going to talk very clearly about podcast rebranding and goal setting around that, okay? Goal setting for your podcast rebrand, why it's important, why you need to do it, and really how you do it, okay? So we're going to look at that in just one moment. But hey, before I do that, I just want to give a shout out to my guys over at AWeber who continue to serve me, the Rebel-Based Media community, everyone that I work with wonderful email marketing platforms, tools, services, and guidance. Now, building an audience is one thing, but engaging with that audience is entirely another thing. And that's the path to revenue. That's the path to generating income from anything that you do, including, of course, podcasting. So if you are thinking to yourself, you know what, I don't know why I'm not making money with my show. Well, it's probably because even though you've got a bit of an audience, even though you've got some kind of listenership, you're probably not engaging with them very, very much, okay? And that can be very, very difficult, because why should people engage with you? Why should people get involved with you if you aren't willing to give something back? And that's what AWeber does for me. It allows me to give back to my community. So please go ahead and check it out at markasquith.com/AWeber. Now, I've set up so many podcasts in the past. I mean, when I'm looking at my Captivate.fm podcasting dashboard, I've got the Straight Talking Guide to Launching Your First Product. I've got 4 volumes of interview shows, the Mark Asquith Interviews series under the Excellence Expected banner. I've got Spark of Rebellion. I've got Captivate, the podcast. I've got Founders Fireside. I've got this show, the Podcast Accelerator. I've got 4 volumes of the 7-Minute Mentor archives. And it's just a lot of podcasts. It's great. And those first 4 volumes that I did, those Mark Asquith interview series, they were essentially shooting from the hip, because all I wanted to do at that point, back in 2013, 2014, was to build my network, both of podcasters and of people in tech and in startups and in business that I would become friends with and later go on to do business with. That was the goal of that show, but I kind of shot from the hip a little bit. With everything else, I didn't, because shooting from the hip when you start your podcast can be forgiven. I did it. Like I said, I just said I did that. But when you create your sort of second shows and your third shows and your fourth shows and your fifth shows, or decide to do a little bit more with your podcast, maybe you decide to rebrand it and just do more with it, well, you can't actually shoot from the hip anymore. Goal setting is vital. You know, what do you want from this thing? What do you want from this show? Why are you doing it? And what you'll notice is that over the last couple of episodes, I've given you the opportunity to, number one, ask yourself some questions that are very, very pertinent to the why of doing a podcast. And then I told you about getting some listener feedback, gauging your listeners. What do they believe your show does? What do they get from it? What value do they seek from that? And ultimately, do you deliver that for them? So we've got all this information now. We understand, okay, why do the listeners tune in? How would they describe my show to a friend if they were to describe it? And number 2, we know why we are doing this. We understand why we as podcast creators are doing what we do, okay? So with that in mind, you've got to understand that podcast goal setting from that perspective becomes easy. And actually, if you think about it, there are only really 3 things that you can do. And actually, I'd posit there are only 2 things, with the second thing being broken down into 2 parts, okay? The first part of this is, actually, the goal can only really be to build a network, which is why people do interview shows. It's why you see entrepreneurs churning out 10 interview shows a week, because they want to build a network. So that's kind of goal number 1. You know, is that your goal? Build a network. If so, when you rebrand your show and when you create a content piece for your show and you start to script it and you start to plan it out and you write the descriptions and everything that goes with it, focus on that. And the second part of it is, actually, The only other thing I can do is probably try to generate revenue. And again, that is completely fine. Like, if that's the goal, that's the goal. But what you've got to understand with this is that you've got to plan for that. You've got to create a show format that is going to allow you to do that is going to allow you to create revenue. And what I mean by that is generate income from a couple of places. Now, I said a second ago, this second piece, this second idea can be broken down into into two places. Number one, something with your listeners. So generating revenue from your listeners, whether that's Patreon like we do with Spark of Rebellion, or whether that is from kind of selling products or services to your listeners. Okay, there are only two parts to the listener model. Okay, you either sell something to them via kind of, here's a product or a service, so go and buy this thing, or it's listener supported, Patreon, and so on and so forth. Get bonus content or extra things by supporting me on something like Patreon. Or the other thing that you've got, the other option that you've got is that you want to sell sponsorships. You want to sell sponsorships, okay? You want to get some brand dollars running through. And ultimately, both of those options, when it comes to monetization and revenue, they both require people. So whilst I believe that you can be an audio influencer, you don't have to have masses of downloads to generate good sponsorship these days. I think you can pitch it in a very, very different way rather than a CPM model. I believe that the best way to do this is still to build a highly engaged audience. So whether you're monetizing via sponsorships or via listener-supported models, okay? So you've got to set the goal around that. So all the format of content that you create, everything that you put together will be focused on that model. Okay, I need people, I need listeners, and then I need engagement, okay? They're the two things that you need from that kind of show. If your goal is to build your network, of course you'd love that, and of course you'd probably love sponsorship, and of course you'd love a little bit of listener support and sales to your audience. But if your prime goal is to build a network, you can focus more on content that's going to do that, okay? So set some goals, okay? Number one, am I building a network-oriented show, so something that builds my personal network, or do I want to generate revenue? And if I want to generate revenue, how do I want to generate revenue? Do I want to generate it through listener-supported models? Do I want to sell products and services to my listeners? Or do I want to do something around sponsorships, or a hybrid thereof? And set those goals. Okay, I want to make this amount of money within this amount of time from my podcast, or I want to be able to measure my network impact within my personal network in this way by this time, and then create content and set goals around that, okay? So I must have X amount of downloads by this time so I can start pitching sponsors. Or I must have this type of open rate on my emails and click-through rate on my emails by this time so that I can then start selling product and proving that my audience is engaged, okay? That's how you goal set for your podcast, okay? That is what you need to do. Please, please, please go ahead and do it. Don't underestimate the power of goal setting. And in particular, if you're rebranding a show, it's a golden opportunity. You would be remiss to go without it. All right. So thank you so much for joining me here on the Podcast Accelerator. Remember to tell all of your podcasting friends that the show is available to listen to completely for free in any app that supports podcasts. And if you're wondering what the best next step is to take for your own podcast, whether you're a new podcaster or you're a veteran podcaster, I want to just encourage you to go ahead and take our short 5-minute survey where I'm going to help you to diagnose one of the 4 or 5 big issues holding back your show and your podcast growth. And I'm going to give you access to the answer to that. And I'm going to give you access to our free, vibrant Podcast Rebellion community, our free weekly group coaching from me and the team here at Rebel Base Media. I'm going to give you an action-packed insider-only email every week and also a free invitation to the Podcast Success Academy. So please go ahead and invest 5 minutes in your podcast. Go ahead and grow that show by heading over to rebelbasemedia.io/grow. And again, thank you so much for joining me. And until next time, do not forget, the more you expect from yourself, the more you will excel.